Hi everyone, my name is Tiffany Zhang and I'm the founder and host of Undocumented History, an online YouTube video podcast. Welcome to episode 13. Although only one-third of South Asians identify as Muslim, after 9/11, many South Asians were falsely attacked because they were, quote, Muslim-looking and therefore perceived as violent, extremists, and terrorists. But Asian Americans, including South Asians, are also subject to the model minority myth, which paints them as docile, hardworking, and passive. How do these two stereotypes paint a picture of how South Asians are perceived? In this episode, Professor Shams and I will discuss her work as a core faculty member at Upenn's Asian American Studies program, how race and religion reinforce each other, and the tensions between Islamophobia and the model minority myth. Here is my conversation with her. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Undocumented History, an online video podcast focused on educating others about Asian culture and history while also amplifying Asian voices and stories. I'm Tiffany Zhang, your host, and today we have a very special guest, Professor Shams. Professor Shams is the Assistant Professor of Sociology at University of Pennsylvania and serves as part of the core faculty in University of Pennsylvania's Asian American Studies program. In 2020, she wrote the book Here, There, and Elsewhere, which challenges the perception that immigrants' lives are shaped exclusively by the country they emigrated from and immigrated to, and she is currently working on a new project about the intertwining of romance and religion for South Asian Muslim immigrants in Canada. Professor Shams, thank you so much for being here today and taking the time to join me. Before we start, is there anything else that you want to add regarding to what you do and who you are?
No, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here.
Okay, so my first question would be, you are currently a sociology professor who has written many works on immigrants. What kind of sparked your interest in sociology and immigrants?
I think that's such a lovely way to start the conversation about my work, because my interest in international migration emerged from who I am in my personal life. I am an immigrant. My family, including me and my younger brother, we all are first generation immigrants from Bangladesh. And the first introduction to the United States for us from Bangladesh when we immigrated, I think it's almost 20 years now, was Hattiesburg, Mississippi. It's a small college town in the deep South in Mississippi where the atmosphere is very much white, Christian, conservative. And when I went to college at University of Southern Mississippi, as supportive as the professors were, I was often the only non-Black, non-white person in any room I entered. And not unusual for South Asians in the US. My parents were keen for me to explore my options in terms of whether I wanted to be a doctor, whether I wanted to be like, a lawyer or something like that. So I was still trying to figure out my path when I had to take Introduction to Sociology to meet my core requirements. And the very first day, I remember we were in this huge hall room, packed like a box of sardines with like hardly any elbow room. And the professor introduced the concept of sociological imagination, which essentially is the idea that we live in society and society lives in us. Our personal story is part of a much bigger history. It's a story of the society in which we live. As much as we shape society around us, society also shapes who we are. And I felt like it was kind of like the Matrix. Like once you choose the blue pill, that's it. It's sort of a different way to view the world. And I suddenly started wondering, well, is my story unique? What about other immigrants in Mississippi and, in other parts of the country? What about other South Asians? And I also happen to come from a Muslim family. So it's like, what about other religious minorities in this very Christian dominated atmosphere? And I switched my major to sociology. And that question inevitably led me to become interested in international migration, to learn the stories of other migrant groups in other parts of the country, as well as, globally in a Western and in specifically North American setting. So that's how the interest emerged. But of course, the more classes you take, the more books you read, your interests kind of get more and more informed, more and more focused. But that's another story.
So something you said was that you mostly lived in a white Christian like area. What was your experience as an Asian American growing up?
Well, as I said, that I grew up in Bangladesh, where even though all of us are Asians in Bangladesh, right, we don't really think of ourselves as Asians. We don't really think of ourselves in that kind of a, how should I say it, in that kind of racialized language. In fact, it's after um, internationally migrating. And this is also a very common experience for migrants from, almost any other country where most people are people of color. Um, you suddenly become more attuned to the race category you fit in. Like, what is your race? So, am I Asian American? Well, what does it mean to be Asian American when I'm like South Asian? Like, there are so many, like, Asia is the largest continent of the world. Like, can all people be lumped into this one category? What are the experiences that tie all Asian Americans together? So, you become curious, or I became curious about all these different questions, very soon after immigrating to the United States. So I wouldn't say that growing up, I had the experiences of feeling Asian American, um, as my childhood was in another part of the world. But I certainly understand after reading on 1.5 and second generations of Asian Americans growing up what those experiences might be. So my personal experiences in a very white, conservative, predominantly Christian environment was very much like a double consciousness. I don't know if you're aware of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a very famous Black sociologist, one of the most well-known, the most highly regarded sociologists in American sociology for sure. And he wrote this concept of double consciousness, this kind of this idea that imagine a football game, right? If you are in the game as a player, you have one way of looking at what's happening in the field. But what if you're always in the sidelines? What if you are always made into a non-player? You kind of have a different view of the world. And the idea of having a double consciousness in the context of Black Americans in his work is you are an American and you're Black. You are always have this double consciousness. You are an other, but you're also having to live your life as part of America. So there's this duality that this concept says the self is always struggling with. And in a way, it was my experience as well, that I saw the society from the sidelines. I always felt that my story wasn't ever the standard or part of the status quo, but I was always in the sidelines. And I had always this consciousness that I am Bangladeshi and I'm American, or I am Asian or American, or I am Muslim and American. And these two identities were not always congruent with one another, but most often than not, we're struggling with each other, competing with one another. So I would say that it is not wholly unlike the experiences of Asian Americans who do grow up in the United States, where race is very much in the forefront. And that's how it was for me as well. The perfect combination, I think, for a budding sociologist. So I have no complaints. Yeah. It
Mhm.
also
Yeah, I
made me
think.
aware of my privilege, right? Like when I was in Bangladesh, I was Bangladeshi, right? Ethnically, I'm Bangladeshi. I was part of the majority. My religion made me a part of the majority religion there. And I was never aware of the privilege that I carried, that I was born into, being part of, not an ethnic group that is stigmatized or marginalized, but rather the ethnic group that's not just predominant, but uh, that they are at the helm of political power. Same with religion, and it's as a minority religion, as a racialized, stigmatized person in the U.S. that I became privileged. That I became aware of this transnational privilege that I had that many immigrants don't.
Mhm. I think the experience that you described, like your time in America, I think that's something that many Asians go through, I think, because I feel like Asian Americans, like we feel like we're supposed to be American, but at the same time we also feel other in some contexts. So I think thank you so much for sharing your experience as an Asian American. I think it's something that a lot of people can relate to. And my next question would be like, what do you hope to accomplish as a core faculty member at the UPenn's Asian American Studies program?
Well, it's great to be part of the ASAM program at University of Pennsylvania. I believe it is the largest program, definitely in the Ivy Leagues that focus on Asian Americans. It's extremely interdisciplinary. So it is a treasure trove in the sense that as a scholar, I get to hear about all these different disciplines that are studying Asian Americans, but in different methodological ways, in different conceptual ways. Just going to a talk like a Food for Thought series, for instance, you get to hear what other people are doing in terms of, immigration history or immigration law, or in literature, in movies and films, in music, not just in sociology that I am used to. So what I hope my contribution would be is to use those resources, two things, that to use those resources to inform my thinking in a more holistic way, so that when I study South Asians as the population that I tend to use as a case study to interrogate different sociological concepts and theories, that I have come from a more holistic point of view, that I know enough to reach out or to study the experiences of other Asian groups, not necessarily the one that I'm studying, to learn from them as well, so that whatever case study that I'm doing about South Asians, they can also speak more broadly about Asian Americans as a whole. So that's one thing that I hope to accomplish. The other thing is that, as you mentioned, that there's an expectation or there's a hope or there's a reality that growing up Asian American, that you're supposed to be American, but sometimes you feel that being Asian, you're not American. So trying my best through my work to show that Asian Americans are Americans, right? We are the makers of American society, to normalize the presence of Asian Americans in sociology, but also in normative understandings of different issues in U.S. society, right? It's not just Asian Americans should be studied by Asian Americans and for Asian Americans, but in a lot of scholarships, still whiteness is seen as the norm or the standard. To try my best to challenge that as much as I can, to bring Asian Americans into the folds of mainstream scholarship, mainstream conversations, so that it's normalized, to show that Asian Americans are Americans, and at the same time to show just all the ways in which the racialized nature of our society, how that affects Asian Americans differently. So it's the nuances of being Asian, being American, to bring that into mainstream conversations about any of the social issues that sociologists think about.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like it's definitely more important now because Asian Americans, if I'm not mistaken, are the fastest growing ethnic group in America right now. And I think it definitely is important to, like, I don't know if normalize is the right word, but like normalize Asian American presence in America and make sure that this growing population in America does feel truly American. And I love the work that you're doing with sociology and just like your work on in the Asian American Studies department in general. And something else that you said that struck me was like you said that you wanted to kind of I guess like do like although your like focus is South Asians, but you also kind of want to expand to like Asian Americans as general. I feel like that's something I can relate to because although I'm East Asian, I want my like podcast channel to kind of encompass all like Asian American identities. So something that was something you said that really struck me.
Mhm.
Okay, so my next question would be kind of going on more to like the work that you do. South Asians are often grouped into the Muslim-looking group when they are not Muslims. How do both religion and race play into the discrimination that many South Asians face?
Well, I think that you answered your own question that if South Asians being brown is often associated with the other kind of brown, which is often racially associated with concepts of terrorism, images of terrorists, uh, the brownness that are also associated to Arab Americans and Middle Easterners. So on one hand, racially being brown automatically exposes you to the stigma of terrorism and national security threats and Muslims and immigrants and Arabs being inherently violent and anti-American, you name it. But also religion, because yes, South Asians, Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, they are predominantly Muslim groups. But Indian Americans, who are the largest South Asian group in the United States, predominantly they are not Muslim, they're Hindu. Many of them are Sikhs, but because of their race, they're automatically assumed to be Muslim and therefore exposed to the same kinds of threats that Middle Easterners, Arab Americans, Muslim South Asians like deal with on a day-to-day basis. So there are spillovers that affect non-Muslims as well. But South Asians, again, because they have been labeled or lumped into this one monolithic category based on their uh, complexion or racial ethnic makeup as brown, it affects everyone who are associated with that identity. I would say that another thing, so Asian Americans, as I mentioned, that is, it's such a big, often, very often arbitrary category, right? Very often we think of, if you and I are friends and we're going out for lunch, we don't consider ourselves Asian Americans. It's more likely that people lean towards their national or their ethnic identity far more than their pan-ethnic identity, such as Asian American, and that's fine. Usually Asian American, the identity of Asian American is to make claims, to produce a sense of community and solidarity, to make non-white immigrants coming from Asian countries visible in the context of politics. Um, so the question that often is asked when with regard to Asian Americans is what ties all these different people together? And that is the kind of racialized experiences, the racial hostility or the adverse um, context of reception that the racial makeup of this country often is what Asian Americans from different countries, regardless of where they're coming from, they tend to confront. And one of them is the model minority myth, right? Um, there is this kind of popular perception as well as some scholarly perception as well, that this is a positive stereotype, that being perceived as Asian American, that being brown has a positive advantage in the sense that, well, you are thought of as smart, right? Being Black, being Latino is often not associated with being good at math, being the teacher's favorite. But Asian Americans, they do have that kind of stereotype. But this is a very slippery slope. Like Indians, East Asians, they are all tied together by this racialized stereotype of the model minority myth. But whenever there is, how should I say it? Whenever there is a national security threat, or very recently we saw in the context of the pandemic, whenever there is an epidemic, the COVID-19 experience for Asian Americans was not new. Whenever there was a health crisis, an epidemic in the United States, immigrants were always used as a scapegoat. Asian Americans, the pandemic was not the first time that Asian Americans were seen as disease carriers, right? So the model minority myth slips away. So the race, religion, the intersection of race, religion affects Asian Americans in, in a way that can be put into one generalizable pattern. So not just South Asians, but East Asians as well.
Yeah, going back to the first point you said, I think religion and race definitely enforce each other because, like, having a South Asian identity makes someone seem foreign, and there's like already a discrimination that someone faces for just being South Asian. And then, yeah, like as I said before, combined with the perception that they're also Muslim, like religion and race definitely do enforce each other. But I think another dimension of it is also like gender, because I feel like being a male, like Muslim looking and South Asian, probably all combine together to increase the probability that someone will look at that person and like think that they're maybe like a potential terrorist. So I think all like three dimensions do kind of like combine with each other and reinforce each other.
I think that's an excellent, a very insightful observation you made. That is correct.
And then something that you said that kind of struck me was the model minority myth. You did talk about a little bit about the model minority myth and how it works to cover up the struggles that many Asian Americans go through. But I wanted to ask you, like, the model minority myth and Islamophobia seem to maybe contradict each other at first glance, because, like, on one hand, the model minority myth paints people as like very successful and hardworking, but then as and passive, but then Islamophobia portrays people as like violent extremists and terrorists. So I guess my question would be like, how does American society let these two like seemingly contradictory narratives coexist together, and how again like do they both contribute to the discrimination of South Asians?
Another really great question. And I think that you're right. But the way that I see the model minority myth and this Islamophobic stereotype of brown as terrorist, they have one thing in common, which is they're othering the people in question, right? The model minority myth, at the end of the day, is a stereotype that uh, paints Asian Americans as an other, separate from the rest of us or the rest of them, right? It's a slippery slope. Stereotypes, as you know, they tend to be slippery slopes, even when they're very positive. So and we see that when you study South Asians, Indians, they have, Pawan Dhingra, who is a very famous South Asian sociologist, he does a lot of work on the academic achievement of South Asians, like Indian Americans winning the spelling bee, like almost every year. Still, when the US society is in an uproar or very much in fear of national security threats, um, the so-called positive attributes of being brown fall away, right? The otherness that is associated with the model minority myth is highlighted. You are an other at the end of the day. So when things go well, you are a good other. When things go bad, your otherness is what makes you the outsider, right? You're the threat. You're the carrier of the threat. You're the one that is representing the enemy outside and bringing them inside into the United States. And that's what we see when we look at South Asian immigrants or South Asian Muslim American immigrants. We see that even when they have passed all the tests of assimilation or assimilability, that they have high SES, they are upstanding citizens, they are in every way the model minority, right? We see that we have seen post 9/11 during 2016 until 2019, and even now, that a foreign crisis or an internal domestic crisis, whenever that happens, they become targets of Islamophobia, right? They're no longer the model minority myth. So I think that even though these two stereotypes are contradictory to one another, the common thread that ties them together at the end of the day, having similar effects, similar negative effects on immigrants, is that they are othering, right? They paint um, the immigrants in question as outsiders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like as you mentioned before, the model minority myth and the like Islamophobia seem to contradict each other, and I think that also just kind of goes to show like maybe the picking and choosing that like certain people in US society have, because like on one hand the model minority myth is used to like bolster people, like supposedly like bolster people, but then Islamophobia is like, I guess, like painting people with negative stereotypes. So I think that kind of just goes to show like the inconsistency, but also like just the picking and choosing.
I think the model minority myth also pits different immigrant groups against one another, right? It's like, you're good, you're the good kind of immigrant, you're the bad kind of immigrant, we don't want you. Or the uh, conservative narratives paint um, or white supremacist or white nationalist narratives often use examples of model minority myth to suppress Black empowerment, right? Well, if Asians coming from outside are doing so well, well, why can't Black people be this and that, right? They don't see the different kinds of persistent barriers that affect different immigrant groups differently, or that affect different racialized groups in the United States differently. So the model minority myth is often used to depict one immigrant group good at the expense of another immigrant group, which is depicted as bad, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the model minority myth also is used to like suppress people within, like the people that have the model minority myth upon them. Like I feel like because of the model minority myth, many Asian Americans feel like pressured to achieve a certain like standard, and it harms the people that have this myth attached to them and also other minority groups, as you said.
It does have an effect that, well, let's talk about what is a model minority, right? What are the attributes that are associated to this model minority? One of them is being politically passive and happy. Happy in the sense like you're politically passive, you're not, creating a lot of political unrest, you're not deviant, right? You are very much status quo, you keep your head down and you work hard and you don't talk too much. Well, what if the conditions are against you? Wait, what if you do want to speak up, whether for yourself, for your group, or any other racial ethnic group, or any other kind of injustice? What if your political viewpoints are not congruent to the status quo, right? Being labeled a model minority, being given the illusion that being a model minority has rewards, which I have shown that, at the end of the day, it's not a rewarding label. But the illusion that being a model minority myth gives you an advantage or rewards you uh, also makes you politically silent. That if you speak up, you're no longer a model minority, right? It kind of makes the idea that the good kind of immigrants are the ones that are not rebel rousers. But what if you do have to speak up? What if you do want to protest injustices that you're seeing in the society?
Mhm. Yeah, I definitely agree. And I wanted to kind of pivot to, I guess, like my next question or something along the lines of 9/11. So many South Asians suffered post 9/11 from hate crimes and discrimination. Why do you think that like these important stories were not documented, and how can we be aware of them?
Well, I mean, they were documented and they were not documented. So first of all, like think about or based on what you've read or what you've seen, imagine how fearful the environment was after 9/11, right? And it's very reasonable for people to be afraid after such a massive attack, right? To be anxious and suspicious. Um, when you are making a complaint about when South Asians, the one of the main reactions of South Asian groups was to be invisible, to not expose themselves or not draw attention to themselves as Muslims or as brown, because that would expose them to the rage and hostility and the suspicion that was very thick in the atmosphere at that time. So people just didn't want to draw attention to themselves. They didn't report the hate crimes or the microaggressions or the racist interactions that they've had because that would have drawn attention to their religion, to their race. So there was a lot of silencing, self-policing, self-surveillance that were happening in the communities. And and these reactions are not unique to the post 9/11 era. It can be generalized to other moments where tensions were very high as well, the self-policing and the self-silencing. But with social media acting kind of like as an uh, sort of as an equalizer, where well, if you have had a racist interaction, you may not feel or you may not be okay to go to the police, but you can post on Twitter or I should say X or social or Facebook or Instagram or TikTok about your experience. But at the same time, not all stories go viral. There 24/7 news cycles, constant social media messaging. Stories get hidden, stories that don't affect a large number of people, or stories that do not invoke a strong emotional response from a large portion of the society don't tend to get as much attention. So there are different reasons why I think that those stories, or more stories, I would say, did not get a lot of attention. But I wouldn't say that they were not documented at all, because that would be erasing the immensely important and hard work that Muslim American activists, South Asian activists, Asian American activists had done to make those injustices, those racisms against, again, not just Muslims, but all these different peoples of colors, like the injustice against them, visible.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I guess for the stories that didn't get documented, how should we be more aware of them? Like how can we be more aware of them?
Well, that's a hard question. I think that you are doing a lot more about that than than I am, right? I think that it matters when people hear instances that are troubling, right? If people don't hear anything, they don't know. So knowledge, the kind of knowledge, the kind of public knowledge that you are producing is a great step forward. But the burden is not on you, right? The burden is on all of us. Like academics, there is in sociology at least, there is a push for public sociology, right? To uh, from our privileged positions where we can read, we can learn, we can look into a number of things. We have the time to do that. Uh, to take that knowledge and to take that to the broader audience, to phrase it in a way that is palatable and is understandable um, from different points of views, right? So that's one thing. I think that recently there's been a push as well to make the experiences of Asian Americans more visible in other forms of media, like movies and TV shows, right? There isn't just one Asian American, one stock character in these shows anymore, but Asian Americans are at the lead, like in Oscar-winning movies, right? Or award-winning TV shows. And I think that's a great step forward because Asian Americans know the issues that are very important and relevant to Asian American life, and to have platforms where you can bring those stories is one way to show the undocumented or the invisible stories be more part of the more mainstream messaging.
Mhm. Yeah, I think your work as one of the core faculty members at Upenn's Asian American Studies program is also help to shed light on those undocumented stories. So, yeah, thank you for your work. And I guess my next question would be like, can you tell us about your newest projects, Race, Religion, and Romance, in that sort of book project and any future projects or topics you want to tackle?
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to come here and be a part of this project that you are doing. So thank you for your work. My current project, well, let me backtrack a little bit. My first project was looking at how global geopolitics shapes how South Asian Muslim Americans view themselves, how other people view South Asian Muslim Americans, but mostly from a political perspective. So political identification, political activities, political worldview, political mindset, political participation. So my second project takes that thread to look at a more intimate aspect of South Asians' lives, which is who they choose to share their lives with, like who they choose, who they see as their equals, and who they want to spend the rest of their lives with, start a family with, and whether global geopolitics, not just concerning the immigrants' homelands and the host lands, but other places of the world, how they're relevant to that kind of romantic interaction or that romantic, I should say, the romantic process. So for instance, I remember when uh, the war in Ukraine had just started and people were, newspapers and everybody were talking about and feeling so emotionally like affected by the war in Ukraine. That's around the time when I was doing field work. And one thing that I had noticed, a pattern that emerged from my research, was that when South Asian Muslim immigrants, this time in Canada, when they were considering partners outside of their race or religious group, whether online dating or just dating or even long-term partners, even their husbands and wives, spouses, they wanted to know how their romantic partner viewed Ukraine. These people are not from Ukraine, right? But they wanted to know how they felt about Ukraine and how they felt about other ongoing U.S. tensions in places in the Middle East, because they wanted to see whether their political views, whether, the way that they viewed the world and South Asians and Muslims' location in it, whether those views were compatible with their partners, because that indicated to them that, well, we may be from different races, we may be from different religions, but the way that we see the world, it's similar, or we can understand each other even if it's not similar, that there is compatibility in our romantic partnership. So that was something that was very striking to me. So it's just one example of how I think that the global context in which this very, very private, intimate interaction that's happening, like swiping on an online app or having a dinner conversation with your spouse, like how those global contexts and global political events also permeate down to the very, very private, intimate spheres of immigrants' lives.
Hmm. Yeah, and do you kind of know like when this book project will be completed or finished?
No, I don't. I hope in a reasonable amount of time, but I am publishing article manuscripts in the meantime, so that there are some samples out there of what the book might have, but hopefully in 2 years.
Hmm. Yeah, I will be on the lookout for that to come
Oh, thank you.
out. And yeah, so thank you so much, Professor Shams, for coming on and speaking with me. This was such a great conversation, and I think anyone listening to this would learn a lot. And yeah, see everyone next time. Bye.